Hey guys, tonight we're finding out exactly why you couldn't handle medieval women. So before you get comfortable, take a moment, like the video, and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. If your image of a medieval woman comes from fairy tales, romantic paintings, or films where she spends her afternoon at the edge of dawn, before the great house opened its eyes, a bell trembled somewhere behind the wallpaper. It was not a great sound. It did not thunder through halls or wake the sleeping portraits in their golden frames. It was a small, silver shiver, delicate as the wing of a moth against glass. Yet in the quiet before morning, it carried the weight of command. Somewhere above, perhaps in a bedroom where the curtains were still drawn, a hand had reached for a cord. Somewhere below, in the colder part of the house, the sound arrived through hidden wires, passed through plaster and timber, through silence and sleep, until it found the servants' world waiting in the half-dark. It is said that every great Victorian house had two hearts. One heart beat slowly in the rooms that visitors admired: the drawing room with its velvet chairs, the dining room with its polished table, the library smelling faintly of leather and coal smoke, the staircase rising beneath portraits of people who had never carried a tray in their lives. The other heart beat behind doors. It beat beneath the stairs, behind green baize, along narrow passages, inside sculleries, pantries, linen rooms, and attics where candles guttered in the cold. It beat in places not meant to be seen, where the air was warmer with work and heavier with breath. And this hidden heart was kept alive by hands that history so often forgot to name. Before the family stirred, before the fires were bright and the breakfast silver gleamed, a young housemaid opened her eyes in the dim servant dormitory. The room was still blue with night. The beds were narrow. The ceiling sloped gently above them, holding the last shadows of sleep. Around her, other girls breathed quietly beneath thin blankets, each one suspended for a few more precious moments between dream and duty. A small candle burned near the door, low and uncertain, as though it too feared the morning. Then came the bell again, a tiny, trembling sound from below. She rose without speaking. There was no need for words. The house had spoken first. Her feet touched the floorboards. They were cold. She dressed by habit, fastening her apron, smoothing her hair, tying herself into the shape that the day required. A servant's morning did not begin with sunlight. It began with obedience. It began with listening. Down the attic stairs she went, carrying her candle like a little star cupped against darkness. The servants' staircase was narrow, steep, and plain, built not for beauty, but for movement. No carpet softened it. No polished banister invited the hand. It turned sharply, dropped suddenly, and hid itself from the grander spaces of the house, as if ashamed of its own necessity. Whispers tell us that in houses like this, architecture itself taught people how to vanish. There were doors that only servants used, corridors that curved behind walls, staircases that rose in shadow while the main stairs shone in light. There were passages behind dining rooms so that plates might appear as if by magic. There were hidden routes from kitchen to pantry, from pantry to hall, from hall to bedroom, so that comfort could travel unseen. The young maid knew them by memory. She knew the step that creaked near the landing. She knew the place where the wall sweated in winter. She knew the door that needed lifting slightly before it would open. She knew where to pause, where to hurry, where never to be found standing still. Below, the servants' corridor waited, long and pale in the candlelight. Its walls held the quiet marks of years, the scrape of baskets, the brush of sleeves, the faint darkening where many hands had touched the same patch of wood. At one end lay the scullery, already breathing dampness. At the other, the green baize door separated the hidden world from the rooms above, soft-covered and silent, like a veil hung before a shrine. Beyond that door, the house would soon look effortless. Fires would be burning in grates, curtains would be opened to grey morning, breakfast would arrive hot, boots would be cleaned, dresses would be brushed, water would be warmed, letters would be brought on a tray. The rooms would seem to wake gently, as though attended by invisible spirits. But beneath the silence, there was no magic. There was only labour, repeated until it became ritual. The maid passed into the scullery first. Here, the air was colder and smelled faintly of ash, soap, and stone. Metal pails stood in a row, brushes leaned against the wall. The sink waited in the dimness, deep and square, its edges worn by use. This room belonged to water, to scrubbing, to the endless return of dirt. It had seen more truth than any parlour. A kitchen maid, younger still, bent beside the range, coaxing flame from yesterday's ash. Fire, too, had to be persuaded into duty. It did not simply appear in polished rooms. It began in blackened grates, in coal dust, in breath held near kindling, in fingers chilled before warmth could be offered to others. The housemaid moved quietly. She gathered what was needed: cloth, brush, coal scuttle, tray. Each object had its place, each place its rule. In such houses, order was not merely preferred, it was worshipped. And yet, beneath this order, there was a strange kind of sorrow. For the servants knew the house more intimately than those who owned it. They knew its draughts and damp corners, its hidden cracks, its moods in rain, its sighs in winter. They knew which room held the morning light longest, which fireplace smoked, which window latch slipped in the wind. They knew where sorrow had been wept into pillows, where wine had stained the carpet, where a child had dropped a toy behind a chair and forgotten it. They entered every room, yet belonged to none. The young maid climbed again toward the upper floors, moving now through a passage behind the dining room. On one side of the wall the table would soon be set. On the other, she walked in shadow, carrying the things that made refinement possible. The passage was narrow enough that her shoulder nearly brushed the plaster. Her candle flame bent with each breath. Perhaps this is where disappearance truly begins. Not in death, nor in departure, but in being required to exist only at the edge of someone else's comfort. She entered the morning room before anyone else had risen. The curtains were heavy. The air held the stale chill of night. Furniture stood like sleeping animals beneath pale covers of shadow. Carefully, she crossed the carpet and knelt at the hearth. Ash first, then coal, then flame. The fire caught slowly, a small orange breath opening in the dark. As it grew, the room changed. Shapes returned to themselves. The chair became a chair. The mirror gathered the light. The silver clock on the mantel gave back one narrow gleam. By the time the family entered, they would find warmth waiting, and perhaps never wonder who had brought it back from darkness. This was the quiet contradiction of Victorian service. Servants were everywhere, and yet they were not to be noticed. Their presence was necessary, but their personhood was often inconvenient. They carried messages but not opinions. They heard secrets but kept silence. They prepared rooms, then withdrew from them. They held the private life of the house in their hands, and were expected to leave no trace. To serve was to become both essential and unseen. Downstairs, the bellboard waited in the servants' hall. Each little label named a room above: drawing room, library, nursery, ladies' chamber, dining room. When a bell rang, a small indicator trembled, pointing toward the source of command. The room was named. The servant was not. There is something almost sacred and sorrowful in that arrangement. The rooms were preserved in memory. Their names were engraved in brass, but the hands that answered them dissolved into the dust of daily life. The maid paused before the board as another bell quivered. Not loudly, never loudly, only enough. She turned toward the narrow door beneath the stairs, the one half hidden in shadow, where the servants' passage slipped behind the polished world. From the front hall, a guest might not notice it at all. It seemed part of the panelling, part of the house's breathing, no more important than a seam in wood. But to those below stairs, it was a gate. Through it, they entered and vanished. Through it, trays appeared and empty cups disappeared. Through it moved coal, linen, letters, gossip, grief, fever water, mourning clothes, polished boots, and breakfast tea. Through it passed entire lives in fragments. The maid placed her hand upon the latch. For a moment, before opening it, she listened. Above her, the household was beginning to stir. Somewhere a floorboard answered a footstep. Somewhere a curtain ring whispered along its rod. Somewhere a fire found its voice. Morning spread gently through the great rooms, touching wallpaper, brass, glass, and wood, and below it all, the hidden world continued. One might imagine that such a door would remember every hand that touched it, the anxious hand of a girl on her first day, the weary hand of a footman after midnight, the stern hand of a housekeeper carrying keys, the trembling hand of someone dismissed, the quick hand of someone summoned, the old hand of a servant who had passed through so many times that the motion had become part of her bones. But wood does not speak in the language of names. It keeps memory differently. It keeps it in worn edges, loosened hinges, darkened grain, and the faint polish left by years of human touch. By full morning, the house would be bright. The family might descend to breakfast. The rooms would appear composed and calm, as if comfort were the natural state of things. The silver would shine, the fire would glow, the tea would steam, a newspaper would wait beside a plate, and somewhere, already retreating behind the green baize veil, the maid would become a movement, a shadow, a breath passing out of sight. Perhaps that is why these hidden rooms still hold such power. They remind us that history is not only made in throne rooms, battlefields, parliaments and cathedrals. Sometimes it is made in corridors too narrow for portraits, in the scrape of a brush against stone, in the hush before a bell is answered, in the lives of those who made warmth, order and beauty possible, then stepped quietly away before gratitude could find them. At last, the morning bell faded. Its silver command dissolved into the ordinary sounds of the waking house. Coal settled in the grate. Water moved in a basin. A door closed softly somewhere beneath the stairs, and the maid was gone from view. Not vanished entirely, not forgotten by the stone perhaps, not forgotten by the worn stair, the scullery wall, the dark passage, the little door beneath the morning bell. Some voices only echo when the house grows quiet enough to hear them. And some lives, though hidden behind walls, remain like candle smoke in the grain of old wood, faint, sacred, and still rising. It is said that every old house keeps one door that does not belong to the others. Not the front door, where visitors once arrived beneath lamps and polished brass. Not the garden door, where summer air slipped in with the scent of wet leaves. Not the bedroom doors, painted quietly to match the walls. Nor the tall doors of the drawing room, where voices softened beneath chandeliers. There was another door, a quieter one. It stood somewhere near the passage, or beside the dining room, or at the turn of a corridor where the grand part of the house began to lose its confidence. Its surface was covered not in shining wood, but in green baize, a soft woolen cloth stretched across the panel like moss over an ancient stone. It felt gentle to the hand, almost kind, almost warm, and yet it was a gate. Behind it, the house changed its breathing. On one side were velvet chairs, framed ancestors, gilded mirrors, soft carpets, and the slow glow of coal fires prepared before anyone important entered the room. On that side, voices were low and rounded, softened by curtains, by upholstery, by the thick hush of privilege. A teacup placed upon a saucer made only the faintest sound. A slipper crossed the carpet like a thought. Even grief, in those rooms, was expected to move with grace. On the other side were stone floors, narrow stairs, iron ranges, damp cloths, black brushes, tin pails, and whispered footsteps. There, sound did not float. It struck and returned. Boots answered from the flags. Knives tapped against boards. Water moved in basins. A door latch clicked too loudly in the morning cold. A tired breath carried along the wall, then vanished into steam. The green baize door stood between these worlds. It did not merely divide space, it divided memory. Whispers tell us that Victorian houses were designed not only to be lived in, but to be believed in. They were meant to appear calm, ordered, and almost enchanted. Fires were to be burning before the family noticed the chill. Lamps were to be lit before twilight deepened. Breakfast was to arrive while the silver still held the morning light. Bedrooms were to be warmed, linen folded, boots polished, bells answered, crumbs swept, ashes cleared, curtains drawn, letters brought. Everything was to happen smoothly, silently, as if comfort had descended from the air. But beneath the silence, there were hands. There were hands reddened by hot water and cold stone, hands darkened by coal dust, hands that knew the weight of heavy trays and the shape of every key, hands that folded sheets so cleanly they seemed untouched by labor, hands that lifted kettles, trimmed lamps, carried messages, scrubbed floors, laid fires, and vanished before gratitude could gather itself into words. The green baize veil hid them. It was not a cruel object, perhaps. It had no voice of its own. It did not command, accuse, or weep. It simply performed the work the house had given it. It softened noise. It concealed movement. It allowed one world to imagine itself complete, while another world labored just beyond the cloth. In forgotten corners of the earth, temples were sometimes built with veils before the sacred chamber. Only certain figures could pass through. Only certain eyes could see what waited beyond. The green baize door was not sacred in the way of incense or carved stone, and yet it carried a strange ritual power. It marked a boundary. It told each person who they were expected to become when crossing. For the family, it promised comfort without disturbance. For the servants, it required disappearance. A maid approaching it from below stairs might pause for only the smallest moment. She could be carrying a tray of tea, or a folded shawl, or a silver candlestick polished until it reflected the candle flame like a captured star. Before opening the door, she would listen. Was there conversation in the drawing room? Were guests present? Was the mistress seated near the fire? Was the master reading? Were footsteps approaching from the hall? Then, with practiced care, she would pass through. Not too quickly, not too slowly, not noisily, not uncertainly. In that moment, she crossed from one law into another. Behind her lay the world of sound, the kitchen breathing heat, the scullery damp with labor, the servants' hall where meals were eaten quickly and bells were watched with weary attention. Ahead lay the world where she must become quiet enough to be mistaken for part of the room's arrangement. A tray could be noticed, a fire could be appreciated, a clean glass could be expected, but the person who brought them was meant to remain almost transparent. Some believe that every threshold remembers the feet that crossed it. If so, the green baize door must have held an ocean of footsteps. Housemaids before dawn, footmen after midnight, parlourmaids carrying tea, butlers with decanters, housekeepers with keys at their waist, young scullery girls sent trembling on errands to rooms where they feared being seen. Older servants who had crossed so many times they no longer turned their heads toward the portraits. The door knew them all by pressure, not by name. It knew the hurried push of a servant late for a bell, the careful touch of someone carrying soup, the tired shoulder of a maid with full arms, the slow opening after a reprimand, the quiet closing after a death in the family, when black cloth was being measured and mirrors perhaps covered in morning gloom. Yet the door told no one. It swallowed the evidence. Above stairs, the carpets did their own part in the illusion. Heavy curtains drank the echoes. Upholstered chairs gathered sound into their velvet bodies. Even conversation moved differently there, cushioned by fabric and expectation. In such rooms, one could imagine that life was gentle, because so little noise revealed what supported it. Below stairs, the truth was less polished, but more alive. The servant passages were narrow and practical, often plain to the point of severity. They curved behind walls and slipped beside pantries. They led to linen rooms where lavender tried to sweeten the air of labor. They passed bellboards where brass labels named rooms, not people. They connected staircases too steep for comfort and corridors too dim for display. In winter, they held cold. In summer, they held the smell of heat and work. There, everything echoed. A dropped spoon sounded like a small confession. A pail set down too hard might draw a sharp glance. The striking of a match became a little ceremony. The scraping of boots against stone marked the beginning or end of another errand. Voices were lowered, not because there was nothing to say, but because the walls themselves seemed to listen. And always, somewhere, the green baize door waited. It was the soft mouth of the house. It received the sounds of the servant world and kept them from travelling upward. It allowed the drawing room to remain serene while the kitchen struggled with heat. It allowed the dining room to glow while dishes gathered in the scullery, like the remains of a feast after a forgotten ritual. It allowed the family to believe that the day had unfolded naturally, gently, properly. But nothing in such a house was natural. Every comfort had been carried. Every calm surface had been touched. Every polished object had passed through human fatigue. The contradiction was sacred and sorrowful. The house displayed wealth by hiding the labor that made wealth visible. The more perfect the room appeared, the more invisible the servants had to become. A shining table did not merely show refinement, it showed that someone had polished it carefully and left before being asked to remain. A warmed bedroom did not merely show comfort, it showed that someone had climbed the stairs in darkness with coal, matches, and obedience. The green baize veil preserved this contradiction like an old spell. Beneath the silence, history was being made in miniature. Not the history of kings or wars or great machines, but the history of repeated gestures. A hand on a latch, a candle shielded from a draught, a tray balanced in both palms, a whispered warning in the corridor, a face composed before entering a room, a sigh released only after the door had closed. In the evening, when the lamps were lowered and the great rooms settled into shadow, the door took on a different presence. From the family side, it might look like a humble convenience, a soft green panel at the edge of comfort. From the servant's side, lit by one fading candle, it could seem almost ancient, a veil, a boundary, a green moonless curtain between being needed and being known. The servant standing before it at night might hear faint music from a room beyond, or laughter softened by walls, or the final clink of glass before bedtime. Behind her, in the passage, the air might smell of extinguished lamps, damp wool, cooling iron, and dust. The house would be nearly asleep, but not entirely. Great houses rarely slept all at once. Somewhere, a coal shifted. Somewhere, a pipe murmured. Somewhere, a bell might still tremble. And the door waited, neither cruel nor kind, only obedient. It had been made to preserve an order of things, and it did so with perfect quiet. It did not ask whether the order was just. It did not ask what became of the girls who passed through young and left older than their years. It did not ask how many voices were swallowed so that rooms could remain peaceful. It did not ask what kind of soul a house develops when it learns to hide the people who keep it alive. Perhaps that is why the green baize door lingers in memory, because it is more than cloth and wood. It is the shape of a question. What happens to the lives lived behind the beautiful rooms? What remains of footsteps trained to fade? What kind of history begins only after a door has closed? At last, the candle burns low. Its flame leans once, then steadies. The green cloth darkens in the fading light, no longer bright, but deep as moss in an old churchyard. Beyond it, the rooms above are quiet. Below it, the passage holds its breath. And somewhere in that breath, soft as dust, the hidden house remains. Perhaps it was never meant to be seen clearly. Perhaps some doors do not open into rooms, but into the silence between memory and forgetting. And perhaps, when night is deep enough and the old walls have stopped pretending, the green baize veil still stirs faintly in the dark, as if all the vanished footsteps behind it are passing through once more. In the linen room, time was folded into squares. not measured by clocks, nor counted by bells, nor written in the firm black ink of household books, but folded, once, twice, and once again, into pale layers of cotton, damask, muslin, and lace. Here, in this quiet chamber beyond the brighter rooms, the days of the house were gathered, pressed, scented, and stored away. Sheets rested on high shelves like moonlit fields. Tablecloths lay smooth and white as winter ponds. Napkins, aprons, towels, pillowcases, morning cloths, and nursery linens waited in ordered stacks, each one carrying a breath of the life it had touched. It is said that every great house had rooms where memory lived without being named. The library kept memory in books, the gallery kept it in portraits, the dining room kept it in silver and polished wood, but the linen room kept another kind of memory, softer, quieter, more intimate. It held the trace of skin, sleep, illness, meals, tears, births, departures, and ordinary mornings that no one thought important enough to record. The door was often locked. The keys belonged to the housekeeper, hanging from her waist in a small, solemn cluster. They moved when she walked, softly striking one another like tiny bells in a hidden chapel. To open the linen room was not merely to enter storage, it was to enter a chamber of order, trust, and domestic secrecy. Inside, the air smelled of starch, lavender, smoke, soap, old wood, and human hands. At night, when the house had grown slow and the corridors had cooled, moonlight might enter through a small high window and touch the folded linen like snow. The shelves became pale altars. The cupboards stood in rows, watchful and still. A candle flame moved gently against the wall, and every stack cast a soft shadow beneath itself, as if even cloth had a soul and wished to rest. A maid assigned to the linen room might sit there for hours, mending by candlelight, folding, sorting, counting, smoothing. Her needle would pass in and out of fabric with the patience of a quiet ritual. The thread moved through torn edges. A rent in lace was brought together. A frayed towel was trimmed. A sheet marked for repair was lifted, examined, and folded again. There was no great noise in this work, only the faint pull of thread, only the whisper of cloth against cloth, only the low breath of someone trying not to feel how tired she was. Whispers tell us that Victorian linen was not merely household fabric, it was a sign of order, rank, cleanliness, discipline, and pride. A well-kept linen cupboard suggested a well-kept house. White cloth spoke of care. Smooth cloth spoke of control. Fine cloth spoke of wealth. Everything had its place, and every place had its meaning. The best sheets were kept for the master bedrooms or honoured guests. Stronger, plainer linen might be used for servants' beds. Tablecloths carried the dignity of dining. Napkins belonged to ritual and appearance. Nursery cloths belonged to sleep, tears, small fevers, and the fragile beginning of life. Black-edged mourning cloths waited for grief, folded away until the house had need of them. Each cloth knew its station, as people did, and yet, beneath that careful order, the linen room held a secret language that only servants truly understood. A stain was never just a stain. A torn hem was never only damage. A missing handkerchief, a scorched apron, a tablecloth marked by wine, a sheet damp from sickness, a pillowcase faintly smelling of lavender water. All of these were messages from the hidden life of the house. The family might forget what they had left behind. The servants could not. A wine mark from dinner might speak of a guest who laughed too loudly beneath the chandelier. A streak of soot on a kitchen cloth might speak of a girl who rose before dawn to light a fire in winter. A tear on a nursery sheet might speak of a child who cried for a mother already gone to another room. A faint perfume on a handkerchief might carry the trace of a lady who would never learn the name of the maid who washed it. The linen room received everything. It did not judge. It did not speak. It simply held. The young maid working there knew the house through what the house surrendered, not through conversation, for few asked her thoughts, not through companionship, for closeness had its boundaries. She knew it through cloth. She knew which bedrooms were cold from the weight of extra blankets sent up in the evening. She knew which guest room had not been opened for months because dust rested on the folded covers there like a grey veil. She knew when someone had been unwell, when a child had grown, when mourning had entered, when celebration had passed, when a room had been prepared with care and then left unused. She knew the private life of the household, but she did not belong to it. This was one of the quiet sorrows of service. To touch everything and own nothing. To know so much and be asked so little. To fold the sheets of beds she would never sleep in. To smooth the tablecloths for meals she would never share. To mend the lace that would brush against another woman's skin, while her own hands grew rough from soap, starch, and winter water. The linen room appeared peaceful at first glance, almost sacred in its whiteness. Yet, like many sacred places, it carried a hidden ache. Beneath the silence, a servant's life passed into repetition. Lift, shake, fold, press, stack, count, mend, return, again and again, until the motions became slow prayers to an order that did not include her. Sometimes the housekeeper would enter, her keys sounding softly at her waist. She might inspect the shelves, check the markings, count what had been returned from the laundry, and note what was missing. Her authority in this room was real. She guarded the linen as though guarding the hidden bones of the household. In her keeping were sheets, towels, napery, aprons, cloths for mourning, cloths for illness, cloths for birth, cloths for celebration. She knew that linen could disappear. Fine cloth could be stolen, damaged, wasted, or wrongly used. A household's dignity depended upon vigilance. So the cupboards were locked, the lists were kept, the folded stacks were watched. But perhaps there was another reason the linen room felt guarded. Perhaps it was because cloth remembers too easily. Some believe that stone remembers footsteps, and wood remembers hands. But linen remembers closeness. It lies near the body. It receives warmth, breath, rest, fever, tears, and the faint salt of human life. It is present when people are most unguarded, sleeping, ill, weeping, newly born, newly dead. It covers tables where promises are made and beds where secrets are whispered into darkness. In the linen room, all of these traces were gathered and made orderly again. Where memory fades in other rooms, it remains for a time in fabric. The maid, folding alone, might sometimes feel this without naming it. She might pause with a sheet half folded across her arms, its white length falling between her hands like a pale river. Beyond the closed door, the house moved in muffled sounds. A bell might ring far away. A footstep might pass. Somewhere below, water might be poured into a basin. Somewhere above, a chair might scrape faintly across a floor. But in the linen room, the world was slower. The candle flame leaned. The shelves waited. Dust turned gently in the air, floating through the moonlight like tiny fragments of forgotten stars. She might think of her own bed, narrow and cold beneath the roof. She might think of sheets at home, perhaps rougher, perhaps fewer, but belonging to a life where she had once been called by name in the morning. She might think of the strange closeness of this grand house, where she handled the most intimate possessions of people who could pass her in a corridor without truly seeing her face. There is a melancholy kind of knowledge in such work, not the knowledge of books, though many servants were sharper than the world allowed them to appear, not the knowledge of travel, though their hands crossed more rooms in a day than some ladies crossed in a week. It was the knowledge of nearness without belonging. The linen room taught her that every life leaves marks. Even those who wished to appear flawless left evidence behind. A crumpled cloth, a loosened stitch, a mark on a cuff, a tear in lace hidden beneath a fold. The beautiful rooms above could pretend to be untouched by effort or sorrow. But the linen returned with proof that every household was made of bodies, habits, mistakes, and need. And still, the servant's own marks were meant to be erased. Her stitches were to disappear into the fabric. Her folding was to leave no crease out of place. Her washing, carrying, smoothing, and mending were to restore the illusion that the cloth had always been pure, always been ready, always been waiting. By evening, the stacks grew neat again, sheets in one cupboard, towels in another, table linen wrapped and protected, aprons counted, handkerchiefs laid aside, mourning cloths folded in the deeper shadow, patient as prophecy. The maid closed one cupboard, then another. The room seemed to exhale. Its pale order returned to stillness. The candle had burned low, and its small flame made the shelves appear farther away than they were, like white ruins seen through mist. Marked by the moon, the folded linen no longer seemed ordinary. It seemed ancient, sacred, veiled. Each square held a breath. Each crease held a silence. Each stack became a quiet monument to lives passing through one another without touching fully. At last, the maid lifted the candle and turned toward the door. Before leaving, she looked back. The room did not look empty, not entirely. It seemed inhabited by everything it had gathered: the sighs of sleepers, the warmth of firesides, the dampness of tears, the perfume of guests, the smoke of kitchens, the hush of sick rooms, the softness of infancy, the gravity of mourning, all folded, all whitened, all placed upon shelves. Perhaps this was the linen room's secret. It did not preserve history in grand gestures. It preserved it in traces, in what was used, washed, folded, and returned, in what passed daily through servant hands, then vanished into cupboards before anyone thought to remember who had carried it there. The maid stepped out and closed the door softly behind her. The key turned. The house continued its sleeping. Somewhere beyond the wall, a bell might tremble before dawn. Somewhere under the roof, narrow beds waited. Somewhere in the dark, the grand rooms rested in the comfort she had helped prepare. Inside the linen room, the shelves remained. The folded cloths lay still, and in their pale silence, they guarded the soft white secrets of the house. Not loudly, not forever, but long enough for the night to listen. Some voices only echo when we are ready to hear them. And some lives remain folded into the fabric of history, hidden not because they were small, but because they were everywhere. Behind the grand staircase, where guests once ascended beneath portraits and chandeliers, there was another stairway. It did not curve with elegance. It did not invite admiration. No polished banister shone beneath gloved hands. No carpet softened the rise of each step. No painted ancestor watched proudly from the wall. It was narrow, steep, and dim, hidden behind a door that might have seemed unimportant to anyone who did not know the secret geography of the house. And yet, this staircase knew everything. It rose through the bones of the mansion like a hidden spine, connecting basement to attic, warmth to cold, labor to sleep, command to obedience. It began near the kitchen, where the air was thick with coal smoke, boiling water, yeast, grease, and the breath of early morning work. It climbed past storerooms and pantries, past the shadowed backs of elegant rooms, past doors that opened only for servants, until it reached the thin, cold spaces beneath the roof, where narrow beds waited in darkness. It is said that every stair remembers the weight placed upon it. If that is true, then the servant staircase carried more history than any grand hall. It carried coal dust before dawn. It carried laundry steam at noon. It carried trays of tea in the afternoon, boots after polishing, water jugs for bedrooms, chamber pots taken away before the family woke, folded linen, whispered warnings, hurried apologies, and the exhausted breath of those who were always moving, always listening, always nearly invisible. How many steps were climbed in silence? How many names were worn away by stone? Whispers tell us that Victorian houses were not only built to shelter people, they were built to arrange them. Rooms were placed according to rank. Doors were chosen according to purpose. Corridors guided the visible and the invisible along different paths, so that the owners of the house might pass through beauty, while the servants passed through necessity. The main staircase belonged to ceremony. The servant staircase belonged to disappearance. On the main stairs, a guest might pause halfway upward, one hand upon a carved rail, looking down into the hall, where lamps glowed and conversation drifted like perfume. A lady's dress might spread softly over polished steps, A gentleman might descend for dinner beneath the golden gaze of framed ancestors. The staircase was part of the house's story, made to be seen, made to impress, made to say, here is lineage, here is order, here is grace. But behind the wall, the other staircase waited. Its steps were smaller, its turns were sharper, its air was colder. The wood or stone beneath the foot was plain, sometimes worn in the middle from years of repeated passage. A person climbing it learned not to look for beauty, but for caution. The loose board, the low beam, the landing where sound carried too clearly, the corner where a candle flame might gutter in a draught. Beneath the silence, the house taught its servants how to move without becoming part of the scene. A young footman, perhaps 17 or 18, might know this lesson better than he knew his own dreams. After midnight, when the family had gone to bed and the last guests had departed, he could be found at the foot of the hidden stair with a tray in his hands. On it, perhaps, a glass, a folded note, a small dish, or a candle carried upward for some final request. His shoes had been cleaned until they shone, but now they touched the dim service stair where no one would admire them. He paused before climbing, not from laziness, from listening. In such a house, listening was a form of survival. A servant had to know where people were without being told. He listened for footsteps in the hall above, for the click of a bedroom latch, for voices still awake behind doors, for the faint bell that might call him elsewhere before he had completed the first task. He listened to the house as one might listen to weather. Then he began, one step, then another. The tray remained level in his hands. His body knew how to balance. His shoulders knew how to narrow. His breath knew how to quiet itself. The staircase accepted him into its shadow. Marked by the moon, a small window on the landing might cast a pale bar of light across the wall. Dust moved through it slowly, like fragments of a forgotten star map. Outside, the world slept beneath fog or rain, but inside the house, service continued in hidden currents. The footman passed the back of the dining room, where earlier the table had glittered with glass and silver. He had stood there then, still as furniture, appearing only when needed, retreating when not. Now the room beyond the wall was dark, emptied of laughter, but the staircase still carried the echo of plates, murmured thanks, and the soft authority of those who never had to hurry. He climbed higher. Near the nursery landing, he knew the step that complained if pressed too hard. He placed his foot at the edge, where the sound was softer. Beside the wall, there was a draught that came through in winter, thin and cold as a whispered warning. He knew that too. He knew the cold patch near the north wall, the place where the plaster had once cracked after rain, the door that stuck in damp weather, the narrow turn where a large tray had to be tilted or it would strike the rail. The owners knew the house through possession. He knew it through touch. He knew where the night gathered. He knew which rooms needed fires earliest in the morning. He knew how far sound travelled after midnight. He knew the smell of the kitchen before dawn and the silence of the upper corridor after the lamps were lowered. He knew the house's hidden body, its back stairs, service bells, pantries, passages, coal cellars, linen cupboards, and the attic rooms where servants slept lightly, never far from being called. There is a strange intimacy in such knowledge, to know a house so well and yet have no claim upon it, to move through its secret veins and yet remain outside its memory. The footman passed closed doors behind which the family slept. Behind one door, a gentleman might rest beneath thick blankets, unaware of the coal carried earlier to warm his room. Behind another, a lady's gown might hang ready for morning, brushed and repaired by hands she would barely notice. Somewhere a child dreamed in a nursery bed, while a nursemaid slept nearby with one ear open to the smallest cry. The servant staircase climbed past all of this, touching every life and belonging to none. Every landing offered a shadow, every turn concealed a body before it entered sight. This was not accidental. Victorian architecture often made invisibility practical. Servants needed to reach rooms quickly, without crossing drawing rooms, disturbing guests, or appearing in the wrong doorway at the wrong time. A house that displayed elegance depended upon roots that hid effort. And so the staircase became a sacred passage of absence. It allowed servants to arrive everywhere and appear nowhere. From the basement, a kitchen maid might climb with hot water, her arms aching before the day had properly begun. From the laundry, steam might seem to follow a girl upward, dampening the air around her. A housemaid might descend with ashes, her apron marked by soot. A footman might hurry down after a bell, careful not to let urgency become noise. The housekeeper, keys at her waist, might move more slowly, with the authority of one who understood every door. Their footsteps overlapped across years. Morning footsteps, quick and cold. Afternoon footsteps, tired but disciplined. Evening footsteps, careful beneath trays. Midnight footsteps, heavy with longing for sleep. And still, no footprint remained. The stair did not display them as the main staircase displayed elegance. It did not keep their names in brass. It did not place portraits above them. It did not ask anyone to remember the girl who climbed it with linen until her arms trembled, or the boy who carried coal through winter before his hands had finished growing, or the older maid who knew every creak and could pass through darkness as though reading a familiar scroll. Where memory fades, stone keeps its own quiet record. Perhaps it kept them in the hollow worn at the center of each step. Perhaps in the polished place along the wall where shoulders brushed year after year. Perhaps in the soft darkening of the rail, where many hands touched it only when they were too tired to climb without help. The footman reached the upper passage at last. The tray was delivered. A door opened only enough for the object to pass through. A murmur, a nod. No conversation that would survive the night. Then he turned back. Descending was sometimes harder than climbing. The body, once lifted by duty, felt its own weight again. Down he went, past the nursery draught, past the moonlit dust, past the back of the sleeping rooms, down toward the warmer breath of the lower house. The staircase received him without praise. It had received thousands before him. By now, the great staircase at the front of the house stood empty and magnificent in darkness. Moonlight touched its polished rail. Portraits watched over nothing. It seemed peaceful, almost sacred in its stillness. But behind the wall, the servant staircase held the deeper silence, the silence of work completed, names unspoken, and lives moving through hidden channels so that another world might appear effortless. At the bottom, the footman stepped into the corridor below stairs. Somewhere, a coal settled in the range. Somewhere, water cooled in a basin. Somewhere, another servant turned in a narrow bed beneath the roof, dreaming only lightly, because the house was never finished asking. The staircase stood behind him, dark from foot to landing. No footprint remained on it, no written mark, no carved initial. Only the worn stone, the old wood, the quiet air. And perhaps, when the house finally slept, when the family rooms were still, and the lamps were out, when the last bell had stopped trembling behind the walls, the hidden stair continued to hear them, all those vanished servants, climbing and descending in the deep memory of the house. Some voices only echo when we are ready to listen, and some footsteps, though erased from sight, go on moving through the dark, softly, patiently, like breath beneath stone. At dusk, when the great house began to gather shadows into its corners, a wooden board hung quietly on the servants' hall wall. It was not large enough to frighten anyone. It did not wear the grandeur of a portrait, nor the solemn beauty of a clock, nor the carved authority of a family crest. It was only a board of dark wood, fitted with brass labels and small metal indicators, each one connected by hidden wires to a room above. Drawing room, morning room, nursery, library, ladies' chamber, dining room. Each name was engraved neatly, as if the rooms themselves were noble beings deserving of remembrance. Each label shone faintly in the candlelight, worn smooth by years of glances, dusting cloths, and anxious attention. Above and below them, the little arrows rested like sleeping birds, waiting to tremble. It is said that every house has a voice. Some houses speak through floorboards, some through pipes, chimneys, shutters, or rain on glass. But in a Victorian house, The voice of command often came through bells. Thin, silver, sudden bells. Bells that passed through walls. Bells that arrived from rooms where no servant was standing, carrying the invisible will of someone seated far away. The bellboard was the place where those unseen commands became visible. It hung in the servants' hall, like a sacred chart of obligation, a map of where attention must travel next. It did not show roads or rivers. It showed expectation. It showed the hidden weather of the house, where someone wanted tea, where a fire had dimmed, where a child had stirred, where a book had fallen, where a lady wished for a shawl, where a gentleman had remembered a letter. The rooms were named, the servants were not. Beneath the silence, that was the first mystery of the board. It remembered the chambers above, but not the hands below. It preserved the drawing room in brass, the library in brass, the ladies' chamber in brass. But the girl who answered the bell at dawn, the footman who rose from his unfinished meal, the maid who left her shoes half unlaced beside the fire, their names passed through the house like breath through a keyhole. Present, necessary, gone. At evening, the servants' hall was neither fully restful nor fully awake. It was a place between labours, a pause that could be broken at any moment. A long table might stand in the middle, worn at the edges from elbows, plates, and years of hurried meals. Chairs sat close to the wall. A lamp burned low. The smell of bread, soap, extinguished coal, wool, and kitchen steam settled into the air. A maid might be polishing a spoon until her own tired face blurred in its silver curve. Another might be sewing a torn cuff. A footman might loosen one shoe beneath the table, careful not to seem too comfortable. Someone might lift a cup of tea with both hands, feeling its warmth as though it were a private blessing. Then, softly, from the wall, a tremble, not a shout, not a command spoken aloud, only a small metallic shiver. Everyone would look. The indicator for the library had moved, and just like that, the pause was over. Whispers tell us that these bell systems were marvels of domestic control, though they seemed humble enough. A cord pulled in an upstairs room caused a wire to move, a spring to release, a bell to ring below. The servant did not need to hear a human voice. The house itself carried the order. It reached through plaster, timber, and shadow, as if an invisible hand had passed through the wall and touched the shoulder of the nearest waiting body. There was something almost ghostly in it. A room called, and a person obeyed. The bellboard spoke without a mouth. It asked without asking. It gave no reason. It did not say please. It did not say thank you. It did not say hurry, though hurry was always understood. It did not say your meal can wait, though that too was understood. It did not say your feet are sore, your eyes are heavy, your candle is nearly out. It knew nothing of the body that answered. It only rang. And yet, in the dimness of the servants' hall, the bellboard could be strangely beautiful. Brass caught the candlelight, like small pieces of captured dawn. The labels glowed softly in their dark frame. The wires disappeared into walls, vanishing into secret channels like veins beneath skin. When an indicator moved, it quivered briefly, delicately, like a bird disturbed from sleep, and then falling still again. The beauty made the sorrow deeper, for this was an instrument of connection, but not of closeness. It joined every room in the house to the servants below, yet it did not join their lives. It allowed command to travel instantly, but not kindness. It made service efficient, but also endless, because even rest could be reached. A servant might be halfway through her first quiet bite of bread when the bell trembled. She might be standing near the fire with her hands stretched toward warmth after hours on stone. She might be mending a tear in her own apron, or listening to another girl whisper a letter from home, or closing her eyes for one forbidden breath. Then the board would stir. Morning room, nursery, ladies' chamber. The sound returned her to duty, as surely as a church bell calls the faithful to prayer. But here, the ritual led not to an altar, but to labour, not to holy words, but to corridors, trays, staircases, fires, and closed doors. Still, the repetition had something monastic in it. The waiting, the listening, the answering, the retreating. Hour after hour, day after day, the board marked the rhythm of lives, trained to respond before they were seen. Some believe that objects used in silence become vessels of memory. If so, the bellboard must have carried thousands of vanished moments. It knew the anxious glance of the new maid, who could not yet tell one bell from another. It knew the steady gaze of the old housekeeper, who read the board as easily as a priest might read a sacred text. It knew the irritation of interrupted meals, the dread of being summoned by a difficult mistress, the tenderness of a nursery bell at night, the heaviness of a bedroom bell during illness. It knew the summons before births, the summons before deaths, the summons for hot water, cold cloths, letters, lamps, fires, meals, medicine, morning clothes, and morning tea. And always, after the bell, someone rose. The servant's name might have been Mary, Ellen, Sarah, Thomas, William, Jane, or something else entirely. Something loved once in a village kitchen, called across a lane, written in a mother's careful hand. But inside the great house, names could narrow into duties. Housemaid, footman, cook, butler, nursemaid, scullery girl. The work became the title became the person became movement through the house, up the staircase, along the passage, through the green baize door, into the room, out again. The bellboard watched them go. In this way, Victorian houses were connected not only by doors and corridors, but by signals of expectation. The family lived among visible comforts, while the servants lived among invisible lines. Wires ran behind plaster like hidden roots. Bells rang from bedrooms, parlours, libraries, nurseries. The house became a web of need, and every need descended. A guest in the drawing room might never imagine the path their small request would travel. A hand pulled a cord, and somewhere below, a bell stirred. A maid rose. A tray was prepared. Feet climbed back stairs. A door opened softly. The requested object appeared. To the guest, it may have seemed effortless. To the house, it was a ritual. To the servant, it was another interruption stitched into an already endless day. Beneath the silence, the board carried a quiet contradiction. It gave servants knowledge of the whole house, yet no power over it. They knew which rooms called most often. They knew who was restless, who was demanding, who was ill, who was lonely, who rang at strange hours, and who never rang at all. They learned moods by bells. They learned habits by indicators. They learned the unseen lives above by the frequency of command. A trembling arrow could mean impatience, or fear, or grief, or a child waking in darkness. The board did not explain, it only pointed. As night deepened, the servants' hall grew quieter. The kitchen fires lowered. The long day loosened its grip, though never completely. Shadows thickened along the walls. The brass labels dulled. One by one, the household sounds softened. Plates stacked, doors closed, water poured away, steps fading down passages. Above stairs, lamps were extinguished in the grand rooms. Curtains held the darkness. Beds received their sleepers. Still, the bellboard waited. It was most mysterious at night. In daylight, it belonged to routine. At night, it seemed to belong to memory. The candle flame near it might lean and recover. The wooden frame might creak softly as the house cooled. Dust gathered along the brass, pale as powdered bone. The little arrows, so obedient by day, seemed almost watchful in the dark. Then, once, a bell moved. Not loudly, only once. The indicator trembled for a room no one had used in weeks. The morning room, perhaps. Or the Old West bedroom, or a library, closed for the season. No one knew why. A draught, perhaps. A slack wire, a spring loosening in the wall, some small imperfection of metal and age. Houses are full of such things. They settle, they murmur, they answer the weather. And yet, for one suspended breath, the servants might have stared at the board, as though the house itself had remembered someone. Someone who had answered too often. Someone whose name had faded from the wage book, from the census line, from the attic bed, from the minds of those above stairs. Someone who had once risen to that same bell in the cold of morning, in the hunger of evening, in the heavy blue hours before dawn. The arrow shook, then stilled. No one went at first. No one needed to. The room had called, but perhaps not for service. Perhaps it had called for memory. There are histories that survive in documents, and histories that survive only in repetition. The bellboard belonged to the second kind. It recorded no diary. It preserved no portrait. It offered no biography of the hands that answered it. But, in its worn labels, its trembling wires, and its small obedient motions, it held the shape of vanished lives. Each ring was a reminder that someone below stairs was expected to be ready. Each silence between rings was not freedom, but waiting. At last, the candle burned low in the servants' hall. The table stood empty. The chairs were pushed in. The board hung quietly in the dark, its brass labels no longer shining, its arrows at rest, like birds folded beneath their wings. Above, the named rooms slept. Below, the unnamed servants dreamed lightly, and the question remained, soft as dust on wood. Can a name truly vanish if a room still calls for it? Perhaps some voices only echo when we are ready to listen. Perhaps some bells do not ring for the living alone. And perhaps, in the old houses where memory fades behind plaster and green baize, the bellboard of forgotten names still waits in the dark, not to command, not any more, but to tremble once more for those who rose, answered, and disappeared into silence. At the very top of the house, beneath the sloping roof and the winter breath of the tiles, sleep was kept like a small forbidden flame. It did not belong to the grand bedrooms below, where curtains fell heavy around carved beds, and fires were banked before the family retired. It did not belong to the guest rooms, with their polished washstands, folded towels, and quiet vases placed beside mirrors. It belonged higher still, beyond the soft carpets, beyond the painted corridors, beyond the warm glow of wealth. It belonged in the attic. There, under low ceilings and angled beams, servants slept in narrow beds. Their trunks were tucked beneath them like little wooden lives, holding letters, spare collars, Sunday gloves, mended stockings, a ribbon from home, perhaps a faded photograph, perhaps nothing at all. The walls were plain, the blankets were thin, the window was small enough to seem like a secret the sky had forgotten to finish. After midnight, when the house below had grown quiet, only the wind moved softly against the roof. It is said that a great house never truly sleeps. It only lowers its voice. Far below, ashes settled in the kitchen range. Pipes murmured behind walls. A shutter touched its frame once, then stilled. In the drawing room, chairs waited in darkness, their velvet arms no longer receiving guests. In the dining room, the polished table reflected nothing but the dim memory of candles. In the library, books stood closed like sealed scrolls, guarding the thoughts of men who had written by lamplight and never imagined the girls sleeping above them. The servants climbed to the attic after the last duties were done. The fires had been banked, the boots had been cleaned, the dishes had been carried down and washed, the lamps had been lowered, the nursery had been checked. The bellboard had finally fallen still, though never so still that one could trust it completely. Only then did the hidden stair receive the final slow footsteps of the day. A maid climbed with a candle in one hand, shielding the flame from the draught with the other. Her feet knew each step by pain and habit. The house was dark now, but not unfamiliar. She had passed through its secret veins since before dawn, from scullery to passage, from passage to linen room, from linen room to bedroom, from bedroom to back stair, always moving, always listening, always becoming part of the work rather than the world. At the top, the attic door opened. A breath of cold air met her. The room beneath the roof was quiet, except for the soft breathing of those already asleep. Shapes lay under blankets. A chair stood beside one bed. A pair of worn shoes rested beneath another. A candle had burned down in its holder, leaving a small pool of wax like a pale moon fallen on the table. She crossed to her bed without waking anyone. The mattress was thin, The blanket held little warmth. Still, after the long descent of labor through the body, even this narrow bed must have seemed like a shore reached after dark water. She sat for a moment before lying down, too tired at first to surrender. Beneath the silence, sleep was not simple. For the servants, rest was fragile. It could be broken by the morning bell, by the call of illness, by a mistress wanting hot water, by a child crying in the nursery, by the fear of having overslept, by the knowledge that dismissal could come like weather, sudden and cold. Even in bed, the body remembered duty. It listened while it lay still. The young maid turned toward the little window. Outside, moonlight touched the chimney pots and made them look like dark sentinels on a roof of slate. Smoke no longer rose from most of them. The night had settled over the city or countryside beyond, softening lanes, trees, walls, and garden paths into one blue-grey dream. Somewhere far away, perhaps, a village slept. Perhaps the village she had left. She thought of it quietly, not with sharp longing, for sharpness belonged to the waking day. Rather, with the soft ache that comes when memory walks barefoot through the mind. A small cottage, a road after rain, a mother's voice calling from a doorway, a church bell on Sunday, the smell of bread, the sound of a gate closing, a younger brother asleep near the hearth. The life that had once known her by name before the great house knew her by duty. In the attic, her name existed differently. Below stairs, she was useful. Above stairs, she was nearly invisible. In the household book, she might be recorded by position, wages, and conduct. In daily speech, she might be called by her first name, or by her role, or by a tone of command that made both unnecessary. Yet inside herself, beneath the apron, beneath the aching shoulders, beneath the training of silence, there remained a private soul no bell could fully summon. Around her, other servants breathed in darkness. Each one carried a hidden country of memory. The footman who had stood behind chairs at dinner might dream of fields, or brothers, or a future shop of his own. The kitchen maid might dream of sleep itself, deep and unbroken. The nursemaid might listen even in dreams for a child's cry. The older maid might no longer dream of leaving, but only of enduring with dignity one more winter, one more household, one more year. The attic held them all. It was not only a room, it was a borderland between service and dream. Below it lay the mansion in all its arrangements, the hierarchy of rooms, the pull of bells, the authority of doors, the great order of visible and invisible life. Above it lay only roof, sky, weather, stars. In that thin space between the house and the heavens, servants rested as close to freedom as the building allowed. Whispers tell us that attic rooms in Victorian houses often revealed the quiet contradiction of domestic service. Servants lived inside luxury, but not within comfort. They warmed rooms they did not sleep in. They polished mirrors in which they rarely paused to look. They carried linen to beds wider and softer than their own. They laid fires for those who would wake without knowing the cold that had been climbed through to make warmth possible. They were close to wealth, but folded into corners, like spare cloth, like old letters, like dust beneath a locked chest. And still, there was tenderness in the attic, because human beings make tenderness wherever they are left long enough with one another. A whispered goodnight, a shared candle, a borrowed pin, a ribbon tied for someone on her half-day out, a quiet laugh smothered under blankets, a letter read twice before sleep, a heel rubbed after hours on stone, a hand placed for a moment on another's arm when homesickness rose too near the surface. These were small things, but small things become sacred when little else is given. The maid beside the window lay down at last. The blanket came to her chin. Her hands, roughened by water and work, rested near her face. The moon marked the room with a pale square of light. Dust moved there slowly, as if the night itself were breathing. She did not sleep at once. The body can be exhausted and still remain awake, held open by thoughts too quiet to name. She wondered whether her wages had reached home. She wondered whether the mistress had noticed the repaired lace. She wondered whether the housekeeper would inspect the linen cupboard in the morning. She wondered whether the bell would ring before dawn. Then she stopped wondering. The house below seemed very far away. For a few moments the attic became almost holy. Not grand, not beautiful in the way guests would understand, but holy in the way hidden suffering can become holy when held by silence. The narrow beds became small boats. The trunks beneath them became buried reliquaries. The beams overhead became the ribs of some ancient shelter. The window became a little gate of moonlight. Marked by the moon, the sleeping servants looked less like workers and more like pilgrims resting at the edge of a long road. Perhaps all sleep is a kind of return, a return to the self beneath the name, a return to the body before duty, a return to the village, the mother, the child, the field, the lost room, the forgotten song. In the attic, sleep came gently, but never entirely. It moved from bed to bed like mist, touching one face, then another, filling the room with the soft human music of breathing. Outside, the wind passed over the roof. Inside, the great house held its secrets. Below, everything they had prepared was waiting. Clean grates, brushed clothes, folded linen, polished silver, quiet corridors, rooms ready to receive morning, as though morning had arrived by grace. But up here, beneath the roof, those who had made the grace possible lay still in the thin hours before dawn. No portrait watched them, no guest praised them, no book recorded the shape of their dreams. And yet, perhaps the house remembered. Perhaps the beams remembered the whispered prayers said into pillows. Perhaps the window remembered the faces that turned toward it from year to year. Perhaps the floorboards remembered the weight of tired feet at midnight. Perhaps the trunks remembered every hand that opened them carefully to touch a letter from home. Where memory fades, ordinary objects become quiet witnesses. Before dawn, the attic began to pale. Not suddenly, never suddenly. The darkness loosened by degrees. The chimney pots outside lost their blackness. The small window turned from silver to grey. One sleeper stirred, another sighed. The maid beside the window opened her eyes before any bell rang, as if the body had become a clock wound by service. For one breath, she did not move. The room hovered between dream and duty. Then, somewhere far below, the house gave its first small sign of morning. A sound in the pipes, a shift in the walls, a distant bell, perhaps, trembling like a silver insect behind plaster. The day had found them again. Blankets were folded back, feet touched cold boards, candles were lit, hair was smoothed, aprons were tied. The trunks remained beneath the beds, guarding their little wooden lives. The attic released its dreamers one by one, sending them down through the hidden stair into the body of the house. Soon, fires would be made, water would be carried, curtains would be opened, the grand rooms would glow, and no one below would see the attic as it was after they had gone, narrow, pale, and still, with the beds holding the faint warmth of vanished bodies. Perhaps sleep was never truly kept there. Perhaps it only visited. Perhaps it drifted in through the little window, rested for a few fragile hours beneath the roof, and slipped away again before the bells could claim it. Some voices only echo when we are ready to listen, and some dreams, though folded into cold attic corners, remain suspended above the sleeping house, soft as breath, quiet as dust, and waiting in the first grey light of morning. In the butler's pantry, after the last lamp had been lowered and the great rooms had fallen into their velvet sleep, the silver still held the light. It rested behind locks, behind glass, inside cupboards dark with polish and age. Spoons lay in careful rows, forks nested beside them like small silver bones. Salvers, candlesticks, teapots, sugar tongs, sauce boats, and covered dishes waited in silence, each one wrapped in the faint glow of a dying candle. The room was not grand enough to be admired by guests, yet it contained treasures they had all touched without thinking. It is said that some chambers do not guard gold because gold is precious. They guard it because memory clings to shining things. The butler stood alone beneath the low pantry light, leaning over a tray with a cloth in his hand. The house above had quieted. No voices drifted from the dining room now. No chair scraped across the floor. No bell trembled from the servants' hall. The evening had withdrawn into corridors and shut doors, leaving behind only the afterbreath of ceremony. On the tray before him, tarnish darkened the edge of a silver dish. He rubbed it slowly, not hurriedly, not carelessly, with the grave patience of someone performing a ritual learned through years of repetition. The metal brightened beneath his hand, first a dull grey, then a soft glow, then a pale mirror in which his face appeared, not clearly, not kindly, but enough. His collar, his tired eyes, the lines at the corner of his mouth, the candle flame moving beside his cheek like a small, watchful spirit. And then, as he shifted the cloth, the reflection broke. The silver forgot him. Whispers tell us that the butler's pantry was one of the most trusted rooms in a Victorian household. It stood near the dining room, yet apart from it, close enough to serve refinement, hidden enough not to disturb it. Here, valuables were stored, counted, guarded, polished, and prepared. Here, the visible wealth of the family passed through servant hands before entering the world of display. The pantry contained treasure, but not freedom. Every spoon had a place. Every key had a meaning. Every decanter had to be watched. Every plate accounted for. Every candlestick cleaned until no shadow remained. The butler knew the weight of each piece. He knew its pattern, its initials, its dents, its repairs, its proper shelf, its correct order on the table. He knew which salver was used for morning letters, which tray belonged to tea, which silver dish appeared only at formal dinners, which candlesticks were brought out when guests were staying. He knew the wealth of the house more intimately than many who owned it, yet none of it was his. This was the quiet contradiction that lived beneath the pantry's glow. How could a man be trusted with precious things, yet not fully trusted with himself? How could his hands be considered careful enough to guard family silver, yet his life remain folded into service, measured by duty, rank, and silence? How could he stand so near to value and still remain outside the circle of being valued? Beneath the silence, the silver answered nothing, it only shone. The butler moved through the room with measured care. He opened a cupboard and checked the rows. He counted without seeming to count, his eye passing over each object with practiced authority. 6 large spoons, 12 smaller, serving forks, ladles, salt cellars, fish knives. The silver was not merely useful, it was a language, and he had learned to read it fluently. A missing spoon could mean carelessness. A misplaced fork could mean disorder. A dull salver could mean shame. In great houses, appearance was not decoration, it was law. A table laid correctly could express lineage, wealth, taste, and control. A polished teapot could carry the quiet message that the household knew itself. A tarnished dish could betray neglect, and so the pantry became a hidden temple of preparation, where beauty was made ready before it stepped into candlelight. The butler locked one cabinet and opened another. The keys at his waist moved softly, a subdued music of responsibility. He stood higher than many servants, entrusted with wine, plate, dining rituals, and the movements of the male staff. He could direct footmen, manage serving arrangements, keep household order, and sometimes act as the quiet bridge between family authority and servant labor. His position carried dignity. It also carried burden. He lived between worlds, but belonged fully to neither. Above him were the family, whose names filled letters, ledgers, invitations, wills, portraits, and memory. Below him were servants, whose work he supervised, whose fatigue he understood, and whose errors he might be required to correct. He stood in the narrow space between command and obedience, between polished display and hidden exhaustion. Some believe that such in-between places are the loneliest rooms of all. The pantry itself seemed to understand this. It was warm with reflected light, but never truly comfortable. Its shelves were orderly, but not restful. Its cupboards held abundance, yet the room felt watchful, guarded, almost veiled. The silver glowed like relics from an old chapel, vessels of ceremony, touched often, praised rarely, locked away after use. A candlestick caught the flame, and stretched it into a trembling line. A teapot reflected the ceiling upside down. A spoon held a curved fragment of the butler's hand. Each surface gathered him for a moment, then released him. During the day, the pantry had been a place of movement. Trays came and went. Decanters were filled. Wine was checked. Glass was inspected. Napkins were counted. A footman entered quietly for instructions. A maid passed by with linen. The dining room door opened and closed, admitting the muted sounds of conversation, porcelain, and footsteps on carpet. But at night, the pantry became different. It became a chamber of echoes. Every object seemed to remember the table it had served. A silver dish might carry the ghost of a wedding breakfast, bright with flowers and nervous laughter. A salver might remember letters sealed with black wax. Candlesticks might remember dinners where guests spoke softly over matters of inheritance, travel, scandal, illness, or politics. A teapot might remember a widow's hand trembling near its handle. A spoon might remember nursery medicine. A tray might remember breakfast carried to a room where someone never fully recovered. The butler knew these objects not as stories in a book, but as burdens of care. He had polished them after celebrations. He had polished them after mourning. He had polished them after quarrels that left the dining room too quiet. He had polished them after evenings when laughter had seemed to rise easily beneath the chandeliers, and after mornings when no one spoke above a whisper. The family's history passed over the silver in fragments. His hands removed the marks. Where memory fades, polish restores the illusion of innocence. The tarnish disappeared. The fingerprints vanished. The dullness was rubbed away. The silver returned to brightness, as though nothing human had touched it at all. That was the purpose of the work, to make use invisible, to make service invisible, to make the next meal seem untouched by the last. And yet the butler's own reflection returned again and again, in the curve of the teapot, in the flat face of the salver, in the blade of a serving knife, in the rounded belly of a cream jug. He appeared briefly, surrounded by light and shadow, then disappeared whenever the angle changed. It was almost a prophecy of his place in the house, seen in pieces, necessary in moments, forgotten in the official shine. The pantry door stood closed behind him. Beyond it lay the corridor, and beyond that, the rooms where others slept. The master in his chamber, the mistress behind curtains, guests beneath warm blankets, lower servants in colder rooms, waiting for dawn. The house seemed still, but it was only resting upon the labor already done. Earlier, he had stood in the dining room, while plates were served and wine poured. He had watched without appearing to watch. He had heard names, jokes, private tensions, small humiliations, soft alliances. Servants often knew more than they were ever allowed to say. They moved through secrets as quietly as they moved through rooms. There is forbidden knowledge in service. Not forbidden because it is written in hidden scrolls, but because it belongs to those who are not meant to speak it. A servant might know who drank too much, who wept after guests left, who received letters in secret, who rang too often, who was kind when alone, who became cruel when watched. The butler, standing near the silver and the wine, might know the household's hidden weather better than anyone, but knowledge did not free him. It only taught him silence. He lifted the last candlestick. Its base was heavy, its stem cool beneath the cloth. Candle wax had gathered in a small pale ridge near the holder. He worked it loose gently. Then he polished the silver until the flame beside him seemed to enter it, multiplying itself in quiet, golden fragments. For a moment, the pantry looked almost celestial, small moons of silver, stars of candlelight. Dark cupboards like night around them, dust moving softly in the air, slow as ancient breath. Marked by the moon beyond the small window, the room seemed older than the house itself, as if it belonged to every hidden chamber where servants had guarded beauty for those who never saw the guarding. The butler placed the candlestick back with the others. One by one, he covered certain pieces with cloth. Brightness disappeared beneath linen. The shine was veiled. The relics returned to sleep. He checked the locks. The small click of each key sounded final, yet not harsh. It was a closing of ceremony. The silver was safe. The house's treasure had been counted, polished, guarded, and made ready for another day of display. Still, one question remained in the dimness. Who guarded the ones who guarded everything? The butler stood for a moment with the candle in his hand. In the darkened glass of the cupboard, he saw himself faintly again. Not as guests saw him, not as a household role, not as authority, not as service, not as a uniform moving through a doorway. Only a tired man at the end of a long evening, surrounded by objects that reflected him but could not remember him. Then the candle bent, the reflection thinned, darkness gathered at the corners of the room. Perhaps the silver did remember, in its own cold way. Perhaps every polished surface kept the ghost of a hand. Perhaps every spoon, every tray, every candlestick held a trace of the person who restored its shine after midnight. Perhaps the objects were not as forgetful as the world that owned them. The butler turned down the flame. The pantry softened into shadow. Behind locks and cloth, the silver waited. It would gleam again at breakfast, at dinner, at weddings, at morning tables, at quiet teas, at ceremonies both grand and ordinary. It would carry the family's reflection into the future. It would be inherited, listed, valued, repaired, displayed, and somewhere beneath that shine, almost invisible, remained the face of someone it was never allowed to remember. Some voices only echo when we are ready to listen, and some reflections, though wiped away by the turning of light, remain hidden in silver, cold, sacred, and waiting for the house to fall silent enough to see them. Below the dining room, where laughter once softened around crystal and candlelight, the scullery breathed in darkness. It did not glitter. It did not receive guests. No portrait watched over it with painted dignity. No carpet quieted the floor. No silver candelabra stood polished at its center, reflecting the faces of people speaking gently over wine. The scullery belonged to another kind of truth, a truth made of water, ash, iron, tile, steam, and hands. Above, the feast had ended. The chairs had been pushed back. The final course had been praised. Glasses had lifted and lowered beneath chandeliers. Conversations had floated across the table like perfumed smoke. For a few hours, the dining room had appeared almost enchanted. White linen, shining forks, glowing candles, polished wood, fruit arranged in bowls, wine dark as rubies in the glass. Then the guests withdrew. The door closed. The glow remained above, but the evidence descended. It is said that every elegant meal has an underworld, a place where beauty returns to wait, where plates lose their shine beneath sauces and crumbs, where glasses carry the faint marks of lips, where knives, forks, spoons, tureens, pans, dishes, napkins, and cooling trays arrive not as symbols of refinement, but as burdens to be handled, washed, dried, counted, and sent back into silence. In the Victorian house, that underworld was often the scullery. It waited below or behind the kitchen, close to heat, water, and the endless return of dirt. Its stone sink stood deep and cold. Its walls held dampness. Its floors knew spilled water, coal dust, soap, and the scrape of wooden clogs or worn boots. Copper pots hung in shadow, their bellies blackened by fire. Brushes, cloths, buckets, and basins rested in their appointed places like humble instruments of a nightly rite. And in that dim chamber, the scullery maid stood at the lowest edge of the household order. Often she was young, too young perhaps for such heaviness. Her apron was wet. Her sleeves were rolled. Her hands, reddened by hot water and roughened by soap, moved without ceremony through the remains of ceremony. A dish entered the water, cloudy with gravy. A plate surfaced pale again. A glass was lifted carefully, turned, rinsed, held to the light, then placed aside. A pot blackened by flame waited its turn, like a stubborn relic from some burnt altar. Beneath the silence, the work began again. Scrape, soak, wash, rinse, dry, stack, return, again and again. There was no single dramatic moment in the scullery, no grand announcement, no heroic gesture that history would choose to remember. only repetition, and the strange endurance repetition asks from the body. The same motions returned each day, each evening, each season, until they became almost prayer-like, though the prayer was not spoken aloud. Whispers tell us that the scullery maid often rose before the family and slept after much of the house had forgotten her. She might carry coal, scrub pots, clean floors, wash dishes, empty slops, prepare vegetables, scour pans, and answer to those above her in the servant hierarchy. Even among servants there were ranks, invisible stairs within invisible rooms. The butler had authority, the housekeeper had keys, the cook ruled the kitchen. The footman moved through dining rooms. The housemaids entered bedrooms and parlours, but the scullery maid belonged to the sink, the ash, the heavy pot, the lowest fire. She was nearest to the dirt that refinement wished to forget. And yet, without her, refinement could not survive a single day. Every polished breakfast began in this room. Every graceful supper returned here. Every shining plate that reached the table had passed through water and cloth. Every copper pan used to prepare delicacy had to be restored after flame had marked it. Every feast, no matter how beautiful above, ended below as grease, crumbs, stains, and steam. The scullery was the hidden altar where abundance was washed clean. At first glance, it might seem ordinary. Only water, only soap, only iron, only tile. But slowly, as night deepened and the house above grew still, the room became stranger, more sacred. Steam rose in soft clouds, veiling the walls. Candlelight trembled in puddles along the stone. The copper pots caught brief golden flashes, then fell back into shadow. The sink became a basin of transformation. What entered it carried the marks of appetite. What left it had been made innocent again. Where is a mystery in that? The grand rooms above depended upon forgetting. They needed the table to be laid as though no previous meal had stained it. They needed glasses to shine as though no mouth had touched them. They needed plates to return clean, silver to return bright, linen to return folded, and floors to return without ash or spill. The scullery made forgetting possible. It washed away proof. A wine mark from celebration, a smear of sauce from appetite, a burned crust from the kitchen range, a fingerprint on porcelain, a spoon used for medicine, a dish carried from a room where someone ate alone, a cup half-finished beside a bed. All of it came down into water. The scullery maid saw the house after illusion had loosened. She saw what remained when elegance was done being admired. Perhaps that is why the room carried a sorrowful wonder. It knew that comfort had a cost, and that the cost was often paid by those least allowed to taste it. A feast could glow upstairs, while a girl below washed its traces away with an empty stomach or a hurried crust of bread waiting near the range. She might smell roasted meat, sugared puddings, sauces, wine, and warm bread, while her own meal came late, simple, and quickly swallowed. She cleaned abundance from dishes that had never been hers. Still, she worked. The water cooled. More hot water was needed. Before pipes and modern ease reached every corner, water itself had to be carried, heated, poured, emptied, carried again. The body became part of the household machinery. Arms lifting, knees bending, back aching, fingers gripping handles made slippery by steam. Copper pots demanded strength. Iron pans held heat long after the fire. The range breathed smoke and warmth. Coal left its black dust on everything willing to receive it. Aprons grew damp and heavy. Hair loosened at the neck. A candle burned low, then another was lit. Above, the dining room rested in dignity. Below, the scullery continued its work. Some believe that rooms absorb the lives repeated inside them. If so, the scullery must have held an ocean of tired breath. It remembered the first frightened day of a young girl newly hired. It remembered the sharp correction of a cook impatient with delay. It remembered whispered comfort from one servant to another, a shared glance over a mountain of dishes, a quiet laugh at midnight when exhaustion made the smallest things seem bright. Even in the lowest rooms, tenderness found narrow ways to survive. A crust, saved for someone hungrier. A kettle shifted closer to warm, cold hands. A warning whispered before the housekeeper entered. A wet sleeve wrung out beside the fire. A moment of silence shared when words were too heavy to lift. The scullery did not only hold labour, it held small mercies. Marked by the moon through a high, grimy window, the room seemed older than the house, older than Victorian rules, older than polished manners. It belonged to the ancient rhythm of human care, to wash, to carry, to warm, to clean, to prepare, to restore. Long before grand mansions, hands had bent over water. Long before silver forks and formal dinners, people had scrubbed vessels by firelight and watched steam rise like breath from the earth. In this way, the scullery maid stood in a lineage no family tree would claim. She was part of the hidden history of keeping life going, not by command, not by glory, but by the repeated rescue of order from use. The last pot waited near the sink. Its bottom was dark with soot. She worked at it slowly, rubbing until the blackness thinned beneath the cloth. Her hands ached. Her back ached. The room had grown quieter. Even the kitchen beyond seemed to sleep. Its great range dimmed, its heat sinking into ash. Somewhere upstairs, the family had entered dreams, wrapped in sheets she might never touch except to change. Beneath blankets warmed by fires she might have helped prepare. She rinsed the pot, set it aside, listened. For a long moment there was no bell, no voice, no footstep, only the faint settling of the old house around her, and the soft drip of water from the edge of the sink. The silence felt almost unfamiliar. It did not feel empty. It felt inherited, as if many girls before her had stood in that same place, at that same hour, listening to the same quiet after the same labour. Girls whose names had slipped from records, girls who had become wives, or cooks, or laundresses, or ghosts of memory. Girls who had left, been dismissed, grown older, disappeared into other households, other kitchens, other stone-floored rooms. The sink was empty now, the plates were stacked, the glasses dried, the copper pots returned to their hooks, dull in the low light, like sleeping moons. The scullery maid wiped the stone around the basin one final time. The cloth moved in slow circles, gathering the last water, the last crumbs, the last small proof of the feast above. When she finished, the surface looked almost clean enough to forget everything it had held. But perhaps the room did not forget. Perhaps the tile remembered each footstep. Perhaps the sink remembered each hand. Perhaps the steam, rising night after night, carried the names upward and hid them in the beams. At last, the candle burned low. Its flame leaned toward the darkness, then steadied. The maid stood for one breath longer, listening to the silence above, where comfort slept behind closed doors. And somewhere inside that silence came a question, soft as water over stone. Can silence be inherited? Can a life spent cleaning what others leave behind become part of the walls, part of the air, part of the hidden soul of a house? No answer came. Only the faint drip from the tap. Only the slow cooling of iron. Only the darkness gathering gently around the sink. Perhaps some rooms were never meant to be admired. Perhaps they were meant only to hold the truth until someone, someday, listened closely enough. Some voices only echo when we are ready to hear them. And beneath the feast, beneath the laughter, beneath the shining table and the candle-lit grace, the scullery still breathes, softly, patiently, with the memory of wet aprons, cracked hands, and a silence washed clean by moonlight. At night, the nursery became a little moonlit kingdom. The toys rested where small hands had left them. A wooden horse stood still beside the hearth. A cloth rabbit lay on its side, one ear folded beneath it as if listening to the floor. Blocks, picture books, ribbons, a tiny shoe, and a half-finished doll's dress gathered in the pale light from the window. The cradle did not move. The fire had fallen low, its last orange breath hidden beneath ash. And beyond the wall, behind a narrow door half swallowed by shadow, someone listened. She was young, though the house had already taught her to move like someone older. She slept in a small servant's room near the nursery, close enough to hear a child turn in bed, close enough to rise at the first cry, close enough to never fully belong to her own dreams. It is said that some rooms are built not for rest, but for waiting. The nursemaid's room was one of these. It held a narrow bed, a chair, a small washstand, perhaps a drawer with folded things, a letter from home, a ribbon, a prayer book, a mended glove. The walls were plain. The candle was small. The window, if there was one, showed only a strip of night, or roof, or the dark shape of trees beyond the glass. But through the wall came the softest sounds of another life, a sleeping child's breath, a blanket shifting, a small cough, a sigh from a cradle. The nursemaid learned to hear all of it. She learned the difference between a restless turn and the beginning of tears. She learned when to wait and when to rise. She learned the language of small bodies before they could speak clearly for themselves. Fever, warmth, hungry stirring, loneliness, fear of thunder, the aching cry after a dream. Whispers tell us that Victorian nurseries were worlds within worlds. They were often kept apart from the adult rooms, governed by routines, rules, lessons, meals, walks, prayers, washing, dressing, and sleep. There might be a nurse, a nursemaid, perhaps later a governess, each with her own place in the delicate order of the household. The children belonged to the family, yet much of their early tenderness passed through servant hands. The nursemaid lifted them when they cried. She buttoned their clothes. She tied their sashes. She washed their faces. She cooled their foreheads. She mended torn sleeves, found lost toys, soothed quarrels, and whispered lullabies when the house outside the nursery had gone dark. She might be the first face a child looked for in the morning, and the last voice heard before sleep. And still, her place was fixed. Her love was useful, expected, almost required. But it was not entirely hers to claim. She could give comfort, but not possession. She could hold the child, but not step beyond the boundary the house had drawn around her. She could become woven into a child's earliest memory, yet remain absent from the family portrait downstairs. This was the quiet ache behind the nursery wall. The room was full of borrowed tenderness. At midnight, the young nursemaid lay awake beneath her thin blanket, eyes open to the dim ceiling. The house was still, but not silent. Victorian houses breathed at night through pipes, chimneys, floorboards, and settling beams. Somewhere below, a coal shifted in a grate. Somewhere along the corridor, a draught touched a door and made it murmur. Rain, if it came, brushed the window in small patient strokes. Every sound mattered. A creak might be nothing. A creak might be the child waking. She turned her head toward the wall. On the other side, the nursery fire gave a faint crackle, then softened. The child still slept. For a moment, she let her eyes close. Perhaps she dreamed of home, a village lane marked by moonlight, a mother's hands folding linen, a younger sister laughing near a gate, the smell of wet earth after rain, a kitchen fire that did not belong to employers but to family, a name spoken with affection, not command. Then a small sound came through the wall, not crying, only a breath catching. She opened her eyes at once. Beneath the silence, duty had touched her shoulder. She rose quietly, taking the candle, shielding the flame with one hand. The narrow door opened with care. The nursery waited in blue shadow. The cradle, the little bed, the toys, the fading fire, all seemed suspended inside a spell. The child had turned sideways, one hand open on the sheet. A dream, perhaps, or the beginning of loneliness. The nursemaid stood for a moment, watching, listening, as moonlight rested on the child's hair. Then she moved closer, not hurriedly, not noisily. She tucked the blanket beneath the small shoulder and placed one hand lightly, briefly, against the child's back. The breathing steadied. The little body sank again into sleep. No one saw this. No one recorded it. No one would remember the exact hour, the exact gesture, the exact tenderness of a servant standing barefoot in the cold, keeping a child safe from the edge of waking. But history is full of gestures no one recorded. Some believe the truest care often leaves the faintest mark. It does not build monuments. It does not sign its name. It does not ask to be praised in the morning. It simply arrives when needed, warms what is cold, steadies what trembles, and disappears before the day can measure it. The nursemaid returned to her little room, but sleep did not return at once. Her candle burned on the small table. Beside it lay a letter, folded many times, the creases soft from being read and reread. Perhaps it was from her mother, perhaps from a brother, perhaps from someone who still imagined her life inside the great house as something grander than it was. People outside such houses sometimes thought service meant comfort, food, shelter, perhaps even nearness to refinement. They did not always see the hidden cost. To live inside another family's intimacy while standing outside its belonging. To know a child's favorite song, yet not be family. To soothe fever through the night, yet remain a servant in the morning. To hear first words, wipe first tears, witness first steps, and know that later, when the child grew tall, the memory might blur until the nursemaid became only a soft shape in the background of childhood. Where memory fades, care can vanish first. And yet, in the nursery, care was everywhere. It lived in folded clothes placed ready for morning, in a basin warmed before washing, in stockings dried by the fire, in a toy repaired with careful stitches, in a spoonful of medicine coaxed gently between reluctant lips, in stories told softly when thunder rolled beyond the windows, in the long patience of dressing, undressing, feeding, carrying, teaching, correcting, comforting. The nursemaid's life was measured in small repetitions: wake, wash, dress, feed, walk, watch, mend, soothe, sing, listen, again and again, until the days formed a quiet circle around the child. The nursery itself was a sacred little chamber, though no one would have called it that. It held the beginning of memory, the first shape of safety, the first rules, the first fears, the first small rituals of morning and night. Its wallpaper might show birds, flowers, or pale patterns faded by sun. Its shelves might hold picture books and toys. Its curtains might move softly when the window was opened for air. But behind its gentleness stood discipline. Victorian childhood, especially in wealthier homes, was often shaped by routine and order. Children were loved, certainly, but love was filtered through rules of class, manners, obedience, health, and moral training. The nursery was tender, yet regulated. The nursemaid could be affectionate, but not indulgent beyond permission. She could comfort, but she also had to keep the household's expectations intact. Even tenderness had a timetable: morning washing, breakfast, lessons or play, walks in proper clothes, rest, supper, prayers, bed. And during illness, all rhythms changed. The room would become hushed, heavy with vinegar cloths, warm water, medicine bottles, and the soft fear that moved from adult room to servant room without being named. A nursemaid might sit through long hours beside a feverish child, counting breaths, changing cloths, waiting for the doctor, waiting for the dawn, waiting for danger to pass. In such hours, class could grow strangely thin. A crying child did not understand hierarchy. A fevered hand reached for whoever stayed. The nursemaid stayed, and yet, when the crisis passed, the old order returned, like furniture being placed back into a room. The child belonged upward. The nursemaid belonged behind the wall. At times, she may have loved the child more than she meant to. Not in a way that challenged the family, not in a way she could safely name, but in the helpless way the heart attaches to those it protects. A child's head resting on her shoulder, a small hand curling around her finger, a sleepy voice asking for the same song again. These things enter the heart quietly, like moonlight entering a room. The hidden chamber behind the nursery wall held them all. Lullabies sung to children who might later forget the singer. Letters from home tucked into a drawer. Tears swallowed before dawn. The ache of giving comfort while receiving little. The loneliness of being needed most in the dark. Marked by the moon, the small room seemed almost ancient. The narrow bed became a waiting place. The candle, a watch flame. The wall, a veil between two kinds of love, the love that is recognized and the love that is used, trusted, depended upon, but rarely remembered. Near morning, the child stirred again. This time the nursemaid did not need to rise. The sound softened by itself. A tiny sigh, a rustle. Then sleep returned to the nursery like mist across a field. The nursemaid lay still. Her eyes followed the pale line of light, beginning to form near the edge of the curtain. Dawn was not yet here, but it was approaching. Soon the house would ask again. Water, clothes, breakfast, brushed hair, folded night clothes, lessons, walks, small corrections, small comforts. The day would open its many little doors, but for one suspended moment, the world held its breath. The child slept. The nursemaid remained awake. Behind the wall, history listened to her silence. Perhaps this is the mystery the room kept most carefully. How many women mothered children who were never truly theirs? How many lullabies passed into dreams without carrying the singer's name? How many first memories were built by hands that later disappeared from family stories? No answer comes. Only the soft breathing through the wall. Only the fading candle. Only the nursery toys resting beneath the last blue shadow of night. Perhaps some love was never meant to be owned. Perhaps some care exists like candlelight, given away moment by moment, warming what it touches, leaving only a faint trace when morning comes. Some voices only echo when we are ready to listen. And behind the nursery wall, in the room of borrowed tenderness, the nursemaid's silence remains, gentle, watchful, and waiting beside the sleeping child. Deep beneath the polished floors, below the carpets, below the music room, below the warmed bedrooms and the quiet library where books slept behind glass, there was a chamber made almost entirely of night. The coal cellar waited under the house like a buried heart. Its walls were darkened by dust. Its corners held a cold that did not belong to ordinary rooms. Even in summer, when the garden above might be full of bees and pale roses, the cellar kept its own season. Damp, black, silent, and old. No guest descended there. No lady paused at its threshold. No child was meant to play beside its heaps of shadow. It was a room the house depended upon and pretended not to know. Before dawn, a servant opened the cellar door. The rest of the house still slept. Curtains hung closed. Fires had fallen to ash. The polished rooms above were only shapes in darkness, waiting to be made graceful again. But beneath them, where stone steps fell into the cold, the day had already begun. A lantern was lifted. Its flame trembled once, then steadied. The servant descended. One step, then another. The air changed as he went down. It grew colder, thicker, touched by earth and coal and the faint mineral scent of buried time. The stone steps held the chill of the night. The walls seemed to draw the lantern light inward, swallowing gold into blackness. At the bottom, the cellar opened before him, low and still, its coal piled in uneven mounds like fragments of a fallen moon turned dark. It is said that every house has an underworld, not a place of terror, but a place of beginnings, a place where the visible life above is prepared in darkness. In the Victorian home, the coal cellar was such a place. It held no velvet, no portraits, no softened voices, no silver laid for dinner. It held fuel, it held dust, it held the sleeping possibility of flame. Every glowing hearth above began here. The fire in the breakfast room, where someone would later unfold a newspaper beside tea. The nursery fire, where a child's socks would warm before morning. The drawing room fire, glowing softly behind a polished fender. The bedroom fire, prepared before its owner rose. All of them began in this hidden chamber, with a servant's hand reaching into blackness. Beneath the silence, warmth was not magic. Warmth was carried. Coal had to be shoveled, lifted, stored, poured into scuttles, carried upstairs, tipped into grates, lit, tended, cleared, and begun again. The comfort of the house was not a single flame, but a chain of unseen gestures. Each ember depended upon someone waking early. Each golden room depended upon a dark one. Each sigh of comfort above had its answer below in dust and weight. The servant bent to fill the coal scuttle. The shovel entered the pile with a soft, heavy sound. Coal shifted against coal, small pieces sliding into place, like broken stones from some underground ruin. The lantern light caught the edges of them, and for a moment they gleamed, not bright exactly, but with a hidden shine, as if night itself had been carved and stored beneath the house. He lifted the shovel. Coal fell into the scuttle. Again. Again. The rhythm was slow, practical, ancient, long before the first footstep crossed the grand staircase, long before the breakfast bell rang, long before anyone complained of chill or praised the brightness of the morning fire. The servant was here. His sleeves darkened. Dust settled on his cuffs, on his hands, on his hair. It touched his face and entered his breath. Coal marked the one who carried it. The house would later display flame, but his body would keep the evidence of where the flame had come from. Whispers tell us that Victorian houses were full of such transformations. Ash became cleared space, cold became warmth, darkness became firelight, labour became comfort. And then comfort was mistaken for nature. A family entering the morning room would see only what the house wished them to see: a grate glowing softly, a chair near the hearth, the curtains opened to grey dawn, perhaps a tray arriving with tea. They would feel warmth before they thought of it. They would receive it as part of the room's character, as though the room itself had kindly decided to welcome them. But the room had not done this. The coal cellar had begun it. The servant lifted the scuttle. Its weight pulled at his arms. He turned toward the steps, lantern light swaying across the walls. The cellar remained behind him, larger now in the dark, as if it had taken a breath after surrendering some portion of itself. Up he climbed. The stone steps did not soften his burden. At each turn, the scuttle pressed against his hand. Dust rose gently, following him like a shadow. Above, the house waited without thanks. It required everything and remembered little. This, too, was part of the mystery. How could a room so essential remain so unseen? How could the source of warmth be hidden underfoot? How could the house glow with hospitality while forgetting the cold chamber that fed its fires? The servant reached the kitchen level first. There, the range would soon be awakened, coaxed from ash and yesterday's heat. The kitchen was still dim, but not as dark as the cellar. It held shapes of work: tables, pots, hooks, knives, basins, cloths. He passed through, carrying coal toward the first room that required flame. In the grate, old ash waited. Fire is never clean at the beginning. Before the glow comes the grey remainder. Before warmth comes the clearing away. The servant knelt and worked carefully, removing ash, setting kindling, placing coal, arranging what would later seem effortless. He struck a match. The flame opened, small and uncertain. It touched paper, then wood, then coal. At first, there was only a fragile orange breath, then a deeper glow, then the soft crackle of awakening heat. Marked by the moon, the window still held the last blue of night. The room changed slowly. The shadows loosened, the cold retreated from the hearth. The brass near the fireplace gave back a little light. Soon, the family would enter and find comfort waiting, as though the room had dreamed it into being. But the servant had seen the flame's hidden birth. He had seen darkness below become gold above. There is a strange sacredness in fuel. Coal is ancient sunlight buried in the earth, pressed through ages, carried from deep seams, broken, transported, stored, and finally burned into warmth. Long before it reached the Victorian cellar, it had slept beneath fields and hills. It had passed through miners' hands, carts, wagons, ships, yards, coal holes, and delivery chutes. By the time it rested beneath the house, it was already heavy with invisible labour. The mansion's comfort did not begin only in the cellar. It began far away, underground, in places the household would never see, in black seams beneath the earth, where men and boys descended before dawn into another kind of darkness, in railway yards where dust settled on faces, in streets where coal merchants delivered sacks through iron openings. The cellar was the final chamber in a long hidden pilgrimage of fuel, and still, inside the house, the servant who carried it became the last visible link in an invisible chain. Perhaps this is why the coal cellar feels like forbidden knowledge. It reveals what refinement depends upon. It shows that grace has a root in shadow. The polished floors above were not separate from the black dust below. The warmed beds were not separate from the scuttle. The bright dining room was not separate from the cold hand that filled the grate. The house's elegance was not floating above labour. It was resting upon it, as surely as the floorboards rested upon beams. Beneath the silence, the coal cellar held the truth of the house. Not the truth told to guests. Not the truth displayed in architecture, portraits, chandeliers and silver. A deeper truth, that every comfort had a hidden cost, that every golden flame began as something dark and buried, that some rooms were kept unseen because seeing them too clearly might disturb the dream of effortless living. The servant went from room to room, a little coal here, a little kindling there, a fire coaxed into life, then left to strengthen. The nursery, the morning room, perhaps a bedroom where someone disliked waking to cold. Each grate required attention. Each room had its own temperament. One chimney drew poorly when the wind came from the east. One hearth needed more paper. One grate held ash stubbornly at the back. The servant knew these things by memory, not because the house had taught him kindly, but because repetition had carved knowledge into his hands. He knew the house from below upward, from cellar to hearth, from dust to flame. By the time the first lamps were fully extinguished and the sky paled at the windows, his sleeves were marked, his fingers darkened. He might wash, but not all traces would leave at once. Coal dust found the fine lines of skin. It settled beneath nails. It clung to cuffs. It could make a servant seem part of the hidden machinery of the house, as though the cellar had claimed him for its own. Yet above, the fires were now beautiful. Flame moved with soft confidence. Coal glowed red and gold beneath iron grates. Warmth spread outward over carpets, chairs, rugs, polished tables, and sleeping dogs. The rooms became habitable, gentle, welcoming. No one entering them would think of the cellar. That was the purpose of the arrangement. The underworld must remain under. The shadow must remain beneath refinement. The servant returned at last toward the lower passage. The lantern was still in his hand, though dawn had begun to gather faintly above. He paused at the cellar door once more. Perhaps more coal would be needed later, almost certainly. Fire was never satisfied for long. Warmth had to be renewed. Comfort had to be fed. He descended again, only a few steps this time, and lifted the lantern toward the room. The coal cellar waited. Its darkness seemed complete, yet not empty. It held the black heaps, the old dust, the scraped floor, the marks of shovel and boot. It held the breath of every servant who had entered before morning. It held the cold before warmth, the shadow before light, the hidden beginning of all the house's glowing rooms. Some believe that buried places remember more faithfully than beautiful ones. Beautiful rooms are changed, redecorated, praised, forgotten, restored. But cellars remain close to the earth. They keep the weight of what was carried. They listen to the house from below. They know what the floorboards conceal. At the end, the servant lifted the lantern higher. For one suspended moment, the flame shone against the coal, and the black stones answered with a faint, secret glimmer. It was almost celestial, like a field of fallen stars buried under the mansion, waiting to be burned back into light. Then he turned away. He climbed toward morning. Behind him, the coal cellar returned to darkness. Above, the house would soon awaken into warmth. Curtains would open. Tea would be poured. Voices would soften near the hearth. Someone might remark that the room was pleasant, that the fire was well laid, that the morning felt less cold than expected, and beneath it all, the hidden chamber would remain, silent, dark, necessary. Perhaps it was never meant to be found by those who only wanted the flame. Perhaps some rooms exist to hold the truth a house cannot admit. Some voices only echo when we are ready to listen, and under the polished floors, beneath the carpets and music rooms and warmed beds, the coal cellar still waits in sacred darkness, holding the warmth of lives erased from view and the memory of hands that carried night upward until it became light.